Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to talk about basing 28mm Napoleonic models. Most of my regular viewers know that I'm completely new to the world of 28mm Napoleonics. I started playing probably about 2 months ago on a whim when my younger son Mitchell decided that he wanted to take it up. Needless to say, I've been enjoying it immensely. I have had to get used to painting some new colors like a lot of yellows and reds, but I've found it an awesome challenge. One thing that I really like about Napoleonics, but also presents a bit of an issue, are the bases on the models themselves. Napoleonics and 28mm have a very large model count, which means that there's a lot of bases to prepare on the table. It also means that there are a lot of models to move. As a result, I've found that a lot of 28mm players use movement trays. This kind of brings up a problem though. There are a lot of systems specific to Napoleonics, and many of them have different standards for basing. That was a bit of an issue. You see, I wanted to use my Napoleonic models for all sorts of different systems, ranging from ones that put 4 or more models on one base, to models where one base is one trooper. What I'm using here is a system I built myself using my 3D printer. And if you like the idea of putting one model per base, then this system might work for you. Incidentally, my basing system is available on my Patreon for any patrons that sign up with Miniature Landscape Hobbies at any benefit level. If you don't want to use one model per base and large movement trays, the skills that I have to demonstrate here for basing Napoleonics will be useful for any way you decide to mount your models. So, let's go ahead and take a look at my method. I hope you enjoy. It probably goes without saying, but the first step is to glue your models down to your base. Now here I'm using models by Warlord, which have a little bit of a plastic rim on the bottom, so on the bases I created, I've made a depression for them to countersink into. But if your base is smooth, all you really need to do is just glue it down on top. If you're worried about the gap, the obvious answer is to use some sort of filler. But if you're like me and you don't want to be patient enough to let spackle or model putty dry, you can just go in, cut some thin strips of masking tape, and surround them around the base to make the slope down to the surface of the base itself a little more gradual. Once you've flocked and glued onto this, it'll form a rock-hard bond that won't be flexible and won't give away the seam. Now at this point, I go ahead and prime and paint the model. I cover these methods in other videos, so let's get back to the basing. It's time to turn my attention to the movement trays, so I get out a piece of black foam core and cut out an insert that will go into the middle of the tray. This will just help protect where the troops rank up from the glue and the grit when I apply it in future steps. Oh yeah, and I also stick a nail through the insert as well so it's easier to lift in and out of the tray. Now I go ahead and get my ingredients ready for the basing itself. I get out 2 plastic cups I can mix in. Mod Podge or white glue, I prefer Mod Podge. Black acrylic paint. Black acrylic ink. Rubbing alcohol, it can be any concentration. a pipette, an old ratty brush, and some water, in this case in a squirt bottle, though it doesn't have to be. Oh, and then lastly, my basing mixture, and this is usually a mixture of about 80% sand to 20% kitty litter. I prepare by putting some Mod Podge in a cup, add a little black acrylic paint to it, and then I just go ahead and water it down slightly. You still want it fairly thick at this point. Now that that's mixed, I go on to the rubbing alcohol component. I get out my black acrylic ink, put a fair amount of it in a cup, and add some rubbing alcohol to it. And it really doesn't matter what the ratio is. Now this is all ready, and I can start the basing itself. Taking the glue and paint mixture, I use my ratty brush and spread that thickly over the base. I try to avoid the feet of the model, but I get around and in between them. When that's done, I get out my grit, and I just submerge the whole base right in the grit. I let the sand and the kitty litter apply to the glue. After I remove it, I do rub around the sides of the base to make sure that any extra grit isn't clinging to the sides. With this finished, and while the glue is still wet, I move on to the next step, and I put a batch of the bases down on something fairly flexible, in this case an old clamshell package from another model. I get out the rubbing alcohol and black ink mixture, and go ahead and layer that on. It'll flow quite freely because the alcohol has got a low viscosity, and it'll soak over top of the grit on the base. Then I get out the glue and black paint mixture again, and this time after watering it down a little more, I pick it up in the pipette and place it down over the rubbing alcohol. The rubbing alcohol in the mixture will help the glue just flow down in amongst the grit, and it'll actually help increase the capillary action so the glue flows off the model if it gets on it, and it gets into the various nooks and crannies. With this done, I set it all aside to dry. It should probably take an evening. The process with the movement trays is exactly the same. You spread the glue, put on the grit, spread the rubbing alcohol, then spread more glue, and so forth. The only difference is that you have the insert in the middle to stop the glue and the grit from getting down where you want your models to rank up. It's now the next day, and the grit and glue is all dry and fastened down to the base, so I start by dry brushing the grit with a dark brown. Once I've got that laid down, I then move on to a quick dry brush of a tan color. I don't get too picky with the color, I just make sure it matches my existing terrain spread. When that's finished, I begin work on the movement trays, and I get out my airbrush and spray them down with a couple coats of camouflage medium brown. While I've got the medium brown loaded, I also take it and spray it onto the rim of each base. I make sure not to spray over top of the dry brushing I've already done, but I don't mind if a little overspray hits the pants of the models that I've already painted. That's because it just adds the appearance of some weathering, wear and tear, and splattered mud on the model itself. It probably goes without saying, but the movement trays are painted in exactly the same way. Now that all the paint has been applied to the grit, it's time to think about adding the scenic effects, and I start with static grass. I spread down some Mod Podge or white glue fairly thickly on the base or around the rims of the movement trays, and then I get out my static grass applicator. Fastening the grounding element to a pin, I touch it to the base itself, and then just go ahead and sprinkle some static grass on. In this case, I want these models to look like they're in fairly well-tended fields and areas, so I use a pretty bright green. Now I can add additional landscaping elements, so I go ahead and get a variety of grass tufts, lichens, and other scenic effects. I always keep a lot of different types on hand, and like to switch them out a lot to create some variety and extra color. Taking out some Mod Podge, I dab it on the bottom of the scenic effect, such as these grass clumps, and then go ahead and apply them more or less at random to the bases, and also around the rims of the movement trays. Once this is dried, the whole project's pretty much complete. All I need to do is hit all the bases and trays with a pretty good coat of matte varnish. And with that, this project is done. Now I've got some movement trays suitable for moving my models around the battlefield, and they have lots of fine little details to make it look like my models are standing in a naturalized setting. All in all, I think it's a pretty good compromise between playability and good looks that helps our models become that much more of a piece of art. Plus, I think that it's really cool that, with my movement trays, when you remove the models as casualties, it slowly reveals the Miniature Landscape Hobbies logo. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please go check out my Patreon. The link is in the description below. And remember that for any subscription level, you can have access to the STL files to make your own Miniature Landscape Hobbies themed movement trays. And who wouldn't want that? Also, you can check out my Etsy store. A lot of the projects I feature in my videos are for sale there, and when you purchase, it really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and please remember to subscribe. And most importantly, until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.